Good morning, everybody. Ambassador, distinguished guests, and summit participants. Also, good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone online. Thank you very much. It's a real honour to be here. I've flown a long way. As said, I'm from Australia. If you're wondering why I'm butchering English, and I come from Melbourne, Australia, or as we like to say, Melbourne, Australia. And you'll hear that throughout this presentation, so you'll have to do some interpretation. I'd like to thank Eda and Kari for inviting me all this way. Iceland, of course, is on a bucket list. I'm a geologist, and I hope to get back here soon for a holiday to really enjoy the place. I'm here on behalf of the Global CCS Institute, and as said, I'm going to talk about the status of CCS. A little plug, CarbFix has been a long-term member of the Institute and a very valued member because of their groundbreaking direction in carbon mineralisation. But we are an international think tank. We advocate for CCS and we want to push CCS towards being a net zero emissions future technology. And when I say CCS, it's a broad group of people now. We've got carbon mineralisation, direct air capture, carbon dioxide removal, and carbon capture and utilisation. We have offices all around the world and 200 members and rapidly growing. Our main role is to produce fact-based advocacy, so we're an unbiased opinion on behalf of our membership, and we like to really push the boundaries with our thinking. So the global status of CCS is our primary report that comes out each year. And I first mentioned carbon mineralisation about a decade ago in a small part of the report. And so that's how we like to introduce new concepts, new ideas in the Global CCS Institute's primary document, which will be released later this year. I like to start my presentation, much like Kari's, it's about the opportunity or the challenge ahead. And we're focusing here on that blue line, here. According to the IPCC's latest report, we need to rapidly expand the geological storage of CO2, and that means in any way possible. To put this in perspective, because that curve is just a curve, it doesn't really mean much. You can't really understand the scale of what that curve means in blue there. But in 2050, we need to be storing around 10 gigatons of CO2. That means capturing from the air from industry, transporting it by ship, by pipeline, and storing it in geological reservoirs. That's around 5,000 BCM of CO2. In 2023, according to the IEA, the natural gas industry was around 4,000 BCM. So if you think about it, in the next 30 years, carbon capture and storage has to be the same size as the current natural gas industry. Think of those large companies around the world, the Saudi Aramcos, the Exxons. Think of the major infrastructure that's been developed over that time to get to that 4,000 BCM. It's a massive challenge ahead, but for many people in this room, it's a huge opportunity, and I'm really excited the way it's moving at the moment. Because quite a while ago, it didn't look that way. In 2015, I was really questioning why I was in CCS. We had that valley of death. Most technologies have it, but it looked very doomed. And then we had the UNFCCC Paris Agreement, and that really switched everyone's thinking. And we've always advocated at the Global CCS Institute for an all-of-above approach. Every technology is required, every technique is needed. And with the Paris Agreement, we started seeing a slight change, a murmur in the room that CCS is going to be part of the solution. Then net zero commitments came along, and we started seeing a rapid uptake in the announcements of CCS projects around the world. So right now we have just over 500 CCS projects, all the way from saying we're doing a pre-feasibility study through to operation. We're still only capturing 50 million tonnes per annum. That pipeline is moving slowly, but not at the pace required. The joy is, in this year alone, we added almost 200 projects in our database. That's the most that we've ever added in a year. And I know, because I'm in charge of the database, that there's 40 waiting in my inbox to approve. So we're going to surpass 200. Now, they're not all going to come to fruition. This is a major infrastructure project. All of them are major initiatives, but we need that pipeline to grow, to exceed expectations in order to meet the goals required of the IPCC. With that rapid expansion, that curve going up, we're starting to see an expansion of geography. CCS has largely been focused on North America, to a lesser extent Europe and the Gulf Coast or Middle East. But we're starting to see CCS projects all around the world. New projects growing rapidly in the Middle East, in China, and in Southeast Asia. There's two very clear spots where CCS is not being deployed, and that's in South America and in Africa. And this is a global issue. Climate change is a global issue, and CCS deployment needs to be deployed globally. So we need to work in those regions. With that expansion of the curve, we're starting to see a massive expansion of industries being applied. We at the Institute have a whole lot of group of members, and they're generally being affiliated with the oil and gas industry, the power industry. Today we're starting to hear from people from the lime industry, the cement industry, glass, plastics. Anyone that has a CO2 problem, they're coming to CCS for a solution, and sometimes we're the first port of call. Traditionally, we've seen CCS projects in hydrogen, natural gas production, coal-fired power stations, and that's why you see a large number of bubbles pre-2030. But pushing out, you can clearly see that it's expanding above just those classic areas. And I highlighted in red here a new key area of carbon capture and storage industry, and that's CO2 transport and/or storage. This was a really exciting addition of an industry that we required to be able to fit into our global status of CCS, because these companies aren't affiliated, these projects are not affiliated with any type of industry. They are purely there to transport and store CO2. That means CCS as an industry has got to a really strong point. Traditionally, we've seen projects capture CO2 from, say, a power plant, a steel plant, transport and store. Now these projects are saying, we will build it because we know you're going to come. And this is the model why they are rapidly expanding. And it's the networks, CCS hubs. With CCS hubs, we get a cluster of capture emitters, capture units emitting their CO2, but then capturing it, putting it into a multi-user shared pipeline and transporting it through multi-user shared infrastructure, eventually to a transport site, a storage site, sorry. And the reason being is because it has economies of scale. It reduces the per tonne for everyone in that entire technical chain. It also reduces operational risk. So if you're a cement company, you generally don't understand how fluids, gases, millions of tonnes of gases can be moved across continents and then buried deep underground. But there are companies that do. That's the oil and gas industry. So that operational risk is also split across the chain. It also creates, one last point there, competition. Competition means reduction in price overall. Last year we added 100 networks to our global status of CCS report. A huge expansion, and the majority focused on Europe. When we look at the CO2 transport and storage network, it is a brand new landscape. The complexity is changing as new capture projects are trying to look for solutions to store their CO2. So traditionally we always had pipelines, then ships came in as a maybe. And now we're seeing combinations of trucks taking CO2 from a plant to a ship to a port to an offshore pipeline, storing ultimately in the North Sea of Europe. And we'll hear about the Langskip project during this conference. Also, for geological storage, we've seen a marked shift when we look at all the projects around the world and where they ultimately going to store their CO2 and why. EOR, or enhanced oil recovery, has been the primary driver for CCS for the past 50 years. And that's because we get a return on investment. You inject the CO2, you get more oil out, there's a reason to do it. Dedicated storage means there must be a market available to store CO2, and there is now a return. Just from that slide alone, it shows where the CCS industry has evolved. This is one of my favourite slides I stole from Phil Ringrose about a decade ago, and I've been adapting it ever since. It shows the diversity in the way we store CO2 and the geology in which we store the CO2. So we're going to hear, I think, from the Petrobras project during this summit, and that is, from an engineering perspective, my favourite project in the world. They are storing CO2, 2 kilometres of water offshore Brazil at a depth at about 5 kilometres. They do that, amazingly, from floating platforms. I think there's about 20 of them now, injecting CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, but still storing CO2. An amazing engineering feat. And then we move across from left to right. So we see the Synovate project in the top of Norway. They're injecting from subsea, so there's no platform on the surface. Of course, we've got the Sleipner project, been operational since 1996. Dedicated storage purely for emissions reduction, showing that CCS and CO2 storage can happen, and we can monitor that CO2 to a high degree. The Tomokamai project in Japan was a very cool project. Kari mentioned it from a mineralisation perspective, but for geological storage, they injected from the onshore to the offshore, and they used horizontal drilling techniques over 10 kilometres to reach their ultimate storage site. And it just goes to show the engineering. If you want to store something, the engineers can definitely come up with the solution. The Gorgon project has been very popular in the media, especially in Australia, but probably in the CCS community worldwide. Their ultimate aim is to reach 4 million tonnes per annum of storage, so by far the largest dedicated geological storage project around the world. To do that, they have to produce the water from the reservoir and pump it into another reservoir closer to the surface. They've had some issues with the water production and they're ramping up their injection rate now, hoping to reach 4 million tonnes very soon. I'll skip the other ones and move over to the last one, and that's, of course, the Carbfix project. So I just added that, and it's the first time I've added a new style of storage and a new project, which has a unique aspect, which is really exciting, because as I said, I've had this slide for a decade. So Europe is by far progressing CCS. We hear a lot about North American carbon capture and storage projects, but we're seeing real uptake of CCS from lots of industries and, of course, CO2 storage multi-user projects. Industry seems to be driving deployment in Europe, and the governments are enabling it. So what you see in front of you on this map is all the acreage that's released in the North Sea and surrounds. When I put the numbers together, it was around 40,000 square kilometres of CO2 storage space available for storage. So that's around the same size as the Netherlands. And when we look at the projects that have committed to storing and how much storage resource they have, it almost reaches 5 gigatons. And if you make a cumulative of all the projects, if they come to fruition, that's a long way towards that that's a long way to making that 10 gigatons of storage by 2050 that the IPCC require, that I mentioned at the start. So really exciting changes happening in Europe, focusing on the North Sea. Of course, as we all know in this room, we need to move beyond just the North Sea and start developing storage sites across continental Europe. So this is a slide I hope my CEO doesn't mind. It hasn't been published yet, but it is to be published. And it's how much storage space we have around the world theoretically. And that's why I put that little tag that we have thousands of years of storage, because it's the theoretical storage available for carbon capture and storage. You can see the majority are low confidence in the orange, and that's around the world. The main reason there is because to get to high confidence, you need to drill. You need to be confirming that the geology is there, that you have the pore space, that injectivity is possible. But still, when you just look at the size of those pie charts, we have 1,000 gigaton storage across East Asia, just under 1,000 gigatons in North America, in Central and Eastern Asia, Europe, 500 gigatons. This was based on an analysis of the OGCI's storage resource catalogue, which is freely available online, something that we do with the OGCI. So that really confirms that final point, that there is really no technical barriers to the deployment of CCS. There's enough storage available, we just need to exploit it. So I built this slide for this presentation, and it's analysis that I've taken from our database. And it's, if every CCS project that's mentioned, including CO2 storage, but also vertically integrated, and their injection rates, if they were to come online on the dates that they were expected to come online, how much would be stored? You can see from the early days, I've put the IPCC targets there, that 10 gigatons by 2050. In the early days, we're meeting those targets. That was an actual surprise for me. I thought there's not a chance we're going to be even close to the ranges that the IPCC are expecting. But here we are. But the story changes very rapidly. From beyond 2040, there's not enough CCS projects being developed, and there's not enough coming online and being announced currently to build up that portfolio. I guess what this slide is really trying to capture is that we need this pipeline of CCS projects to come through. We need it to consistently push the boundaries of capture projects, transport networks, and storage development to enable CCS to meet the targets of the IPCC. Because as I said at the start, it's a massive opportunity, but the challenge is there. So there's no technical barriers to CCS. We at the Institute have said that for a good part of 15 years. I think people are starting to hear that story. And it comes down to one key factor: policy. Policy drives growth in CCS. CCS is not dissimilar to any other climate change technology. So every climate change technology, as an all-above approach, needs a clear policies, long-term, stable, strong climate policies. For CCS in particular, the greater role of CCS in national roadmaps, in white papers, and in the UNFCCC's NDCs. We see when they're in the NDCs, it provides a clear uptake for companies, or a clear green light for companies to drive CCS in their country. Overall, strengthening climate policy, of course, we want that. Most of us in the room, I'm pretty sure all of us in the room want strong climate policy. National CCS targets is an interesting one. So Europe has just established a target to store so many million tonnes of CO2, and that really puts an aim or a direction of projects to develop, because they know they have to meet these targets. The Carbon Management Challenge, these international agreements, international ambitions help bring everyone into the room. Kari mentioned that we need to learn from each other, that knowledge, we need collaboration, we need growth. This happens through initiatives such as the Carbon Management Challenge. Strengthening fiscal incentives. Of course, providing CapEx and OpEx support is going to help anyone in any form of industry, but CCS in particular is vulnerable to needing that early help. And there's precedent. So we have in the past, governments have paid for gas pipelines across Australia, and that developed the CO2, the natural gas industry that we see today. We're second to only Qatar for exporting CO2, and that exporting natural gas, and that started from the government paying for and building pipelines to connect the CO2 infrastructure, the natural gas infrastructure around the world, to be able to export CO2, natural gas around the world. I'll miss that one. I've got another example. It's a much easier one. Around 200 years ago, we decided to put sewerage throughout every major city in the world, and the government's paid for that. And that provides now sewerage that we have today. The final one is a really critical point. Countries need to develop CCS regulations to enable CCS. It sounds a no-brainer, but it's amazing how many countries get to the point of saying we're going to do CCS, and companies are saying, yes, we can't wait, and there's no regulations to enable it. So you can't actually go out and explore for CO2 storage sites if you don't have a regulatory framework to enable it. So what is the outlook for CCS? We see CCS as a critical climate change technology for balancing 4 key areas: economic prosperity and that just transition. Demand for energy, cement, steel, chemicals is going to continue. It's not going to decrease, so we're not seeing any decrease at all. CCS can help the growth of these industries while enabling decarbonisation. For some of those industries, it's the only option. CCS can create new markets: hydrogen, ammonia for fertiliser, great opportunity for a decarbonised new fuels. And obviously the final one is greenhouse gas emissions reduction, carbon dioxide removal, and just reducing emissions from industry. So this is my final slide. I only have a few minutes left, but it's come from, I thought while I'm travelling halfway around the world, and I've been banging on about these same slides for 20 years, there were new faces on the agenda, and that's been a long time for me. It's usually the same crowd talking to each other. And myself, and on the shoulders of brilliant people, I've discussed what are some lessons learnt that if a new group came into the room, what we would tell them from our learnings in the past. So Kari mentioned this, fantastic. Knowledge is power. We need to release the data, your research results. Learning from others is critical. Because in the vacuum of information, misinformation creeps in. And we learned that from CO2 storage. People thought in Poland that if you stored CO2, it'll blow out the ground and catch on fire and blow up a town. Ironically, CO2 puts out fire, but that's where the misinformation happens. So that's why the second point, you've got to communicate the where and how much, but don't overpromise, because the CCS industry has had a long history of overpromising and under-delivering. That's changing now, but for the past 20 years, we've had many projects come and go without any steel in the ground. The second point is actually the most important point. It's social license to operate. It's amazing how many projects get to the final point of wanting to inject their CO2, regulations, the technical know-how. They've undertaken a lot of work, and then they say we're going to inject, and the community says no. Now, we just had an example in Australia, in Queensland, where a project was about to inject their CO2, and they banned CCS in the whole state. And because the farmers were not included well enough in the development of the project. So that's why I say community engagement and regulatory engagement has to be a long and constant process from day one, because it will bite you in the bum, which is an Australian saying. Monitoring and assurance is a critical tool for social license. I've got an example there from Sawada-san in the Tomokamai project again. I seem to mention them too many times so far. But this is a really cool initiative by the Tomokamai project, and the public was worried that injecting the CO2 would cause major earthquakes offshore of Tomokamai. And so they installed a seismometer in the town hall. So anyone could come up and have a look at the injection rate coming along and how much seismicity was being caused. As we well know, it's below seismic limits. And so they could come and see and go, okay, we understand CO2 is being injected, there's no seismicity. So it's a really, monitoring and assurance is a really critical tool for that social license to operate. And the final part is consistent messaging. Terminology matters because everyone outside this room needs to know we're talking about the same thing. For CO2 storage, we've gone through many iterations of calling it different things. There was geological carbon storage, geosequestration, sequestration, carbon storage, CO2 storage, and with that, people thought from the outer community that they were different things, but we're all talking about the same thing. So I did a Google search of papers in Scholar for the, that was Google, always listening, and I looked at all the different names in different papers, and these were how many different hits in about 5 minutes I got. So carbon mineralization, mineral carbonation, CO2 mineralization, basalt storage. And people may think outside this community that they are different things, but we're talking about the same thing. So terminology matters. My final point, you need to enforce the point that the overwhelming evidence is that it's safe and secure. And that refers back to points 1 and 2. CCS has traditionally been an academic exercise, and as we know with academia, we don't have all the answers. And so when you say we can store CO2, academics can say, well, we can, but we need to know this and this. But the overwhelming evidence from an industry point of view is that we can safely secure CO2, and that's a really important message to keep consistent as well. So on that note, I'd like to thank you for my time and look forward to learning from all of you on carbon mineralization. Thank you.